It was about 35 years ago, and things were a little different back then. The world was still getting used to the internet, and smartphones were still a futuristic concept. People relied on physical maps, word of mouth, and their own intuition to navigate the wilderness. And that's exactly what I did. I decided to take a hiking trip to a national park in British Columbia to experience the beauty of the forest. I had heard stories of how awe-inspiring the park was, and I was excited to see it for myself. However, I do not want to mention the name of the national park for particular reasons. The first thing I did was research the area where I would be hunting. This involves studying topographical maps, researching the weather conditions, and checking for any restrictions or permits that may be required. By doing this, I was able to get a better understanding of the terrain, the climate, and the wildlife that I would encounter. Then I was eagerly preparing for my hunting trip. As an avid hunter and outdoorsman all my life, I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. I had carefully planned and packed all the necessary gear and equipment, and I was excited to get out into the wilderness. I remember packing my rifle, ammunition, a hunting knife, a first aid kit, a GPS device, a compass, and a map. I also packed appropriate clothing, including insulated jackets, waterproof boots, and layers to protect me from the cold. I brought enough food and water to last me for the entire trip, as well as extra supplies in case of an emergency. Before leaving, I made sure to inform someone of my whereabouts and expected return date. This was important in case of an emergency, as it would allow someone to know where to look for me if I did not return as planned. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the cool autumn breeze brushed against my face and rustled the leaves beneath my feet. It was a typical day for me, an avid hunter and outdoorsman, but something was off. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, as if something or someone was lurking in the shadows. That's when I stumbled upon a small creek and a man standing in the middle of it, washing something that I couldn't quite make out. He was a free miner, I think, as he wore ragged clothes and had a pickaxe resting against a nearby tree. When he saw me, he motioned me over to his campfire, which had a few logs around it and was crackling merrily. As I approached him, I noticed that he didn't say a word. Instead, he pointed to his mouth area and shook his head, indicating that he was mute. I offered him half of my sandwich, which he gratefully accepted, and we sat there in silence, watching the flames dance around us. That's when I noticed the stench. It was an overpowering odor, like rotting flesh mixed with something else that I couldn't quite place. The man smelled like he hadn't bathed in years, and his clothes were ragged and tattered. He looked like he hadn't had a haircut or shave in decades, and his beard was long and unkempt. But what really unnerved me was his size. He was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and his muscles bulged beneath his ragged clothing. It was as if he had been living off the land for years, with nothing but his own strength to sustain him. As we ate our sandwich, I couldn't help but wonder about this man's story. How had he ended up here, alone in the woods? What had led him to a life of isolation and solitude? But as quickly as the thought entered my mind, the man stood up, nodded at me, and walked off into the woods. I watched him disappear from view, feeling a mix of pity and curiosity. I continued my hunt, but the encounter with the free miner stayed with me. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake off the image of that massive, silent man living off the land. As the day wore on, the woods grew darker, and I found myself lost. Panic set in as I realized that I had wandered too far off the beaten path and had no idea how to get back to civilization. That's when I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was a low, guttural growl, like an animal that was hungry and angry. I turned around, and there he was, the free miner, standing behind me. He didn't say a word, but I could tell that he was angry. His massive frame loomed over me, and I could smell the stench of his unwashed body. I realized then that I was in danger, that this man could kill me if he wanted to. But as suddenly as the growl had started, it stopped. The free miner turned around and walked off into the woods, leaving me alone and shaking. It took me hours to find my way back to civilization, and when I did, I immediately went to the local authorities and reported the encounter. They didn't believe me, of course, thinking that I had just made up a story to cover up my getting lost in the woods. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The free miner was real, and he was out there, living off the land and watching over his territory like a wild animal. What happened that day would stay with me for years to come. When I was a child, my father used to take me duck hunting in Louisiana. It was one of my favorite things to do with him, and I looked forward to every trip with excitement and anticipation. We had been hunting together for many years, and I always enjoyed spending time with him in nature. We used to paddle around in our pirogue, placing decoys in the water, hoping to attract some ducks. The early morning fog would slowly lift as the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow on the cypress trees and Spanish moss that surrounded us. It was a peaceful and calming experience, being out in the wilderness with my father. As my father set out the last decoy and turned his pirogue back towards his blind, I settled into my own blind, ready for the hunt to begin. That's when I saw a huge black hairy blob in the prairie grass, just a few yards away from me. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, but as I looked closer, I realized that it was something else entirely. As I watched in amazement, two red eyes peered out at me from the black hairy mass. I was frozen with fear, not knowing what to do. Then, suddenly, the creature stood up. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a slim waist. It looked like the tallest linebacker I had ever seen, with huge thighs and arms that hung down almost to its knees. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The wind was blowing from behind me, so we didn't catch its scent, and it was gone fairly quickly. I tried to shake off the experience, thinking that I must have imagined it, but the image of the creature stayed with me for days. At the time, no one talked about Sasquatch or Bigfoot or anything like that. I had no idea what I had seen. But after countless nightmares, I finally confided in my mother about what had happened. She told me about a conversation that she overheard between her parents, where my grandfather had a run-in with one of these creatures stealing animals out of his traps. I was shocked to hear this. It seemed that my family had a history of encounters with these creatures, but no one had ever talked about it openly. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, and I became obsessed with finding out more about these creatures. A couple of years later, after football practice, my mother took me to the drive-in theater to see a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek. It was a low-budget documentary-style film that told the story of sightings of a creature called the Fouke Monster in the swamps of southern Arkansas. As I watched the film, I couldn't believe how similar the creature in the movie was to what I had seen that morning on the duck hunt. The Fouke Monster was described as a huge, hairy, bipedal creature with red eyes, just like the one I had seen. After that, I became even more obsessed with the subject. I read every book and article I could find about Bigfoot and other cryptids, and I even started doing some research of my own, going out into the woods to look for evidence of these creatures. Over the years, I've had a few more encounters with what I believe were these creatures, but nothing as clear or as close as that first sighting. I've come to accept that many people will never believe in the existence of these creatures, but for me, there's no doubt that they are out there. Now, as an adult, I look back on that morning in the Louisiana wilderness as a turning point in my life. It was the moment when I realized that there was much more to the world than what we can see and touch. It was the moment when I became a true believer in the existence of creatures beyond our understanding. And it was the moment when I began my lifelong quest to uncover the truth about these mysterious beings. It was a warm summer afternoon in the mid-90s when I decided to take a walk through the backwoods of east central Minnesota. I had been hunting and hiking in these woods for years, so I was familiar with the trails and the thick woods. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt a sense of peace and calm. It was just me and the nature around me, and I was enjoying every moment of it. I have always loved being in the forest, surrounded by nature's beauty and the calming silence that comes with it. There's something about the wilderness that draws me in, and I find myself coming back time and time again. I had been walking on trails and sometimes right through the thick woods because I knew these woods like the back of my hand, and I had hunted these woods for years. Camping in the wilderness was one of my favorite activities, and I often found myself lost in thought, enjoying the peace and quiet of the forest while sitting by a crackling fire at night. As I was walking along one of the trails, I noticed something strange. It was a sound I had never heard before, like the rustling of leaves but much louder. I stopped and listened, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be getting closer, but I couldn't see anything moving through the trees. Suddenly, I heard a low growl, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew that sound. It was the sound of an animal, a predator. I slowly reached for my hunting knife, which I always carried with me on these walks. I didn't want to startle whatever was out there, but I had to be prepared for anything. As I continued along the trail, the sound grew louder and more persistent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew I was in danger. I was about to turn back and head for my car when I saw movement in the trees up ahead. Something large was moving through the underbrush, and it was coming straight for me. I froze, unsure of what to do. I had faced many dangerous animals in my years of hunting, but this was different. I couldn't see what was coming, and I didn't know if it was a bear, a cougar, or something else entirely. I braced myself for the worst, ready to fight for my life if necessary. Suddenly, a massive figure burst out of the trees, and I stumbled backwards in shock. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, standing at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick fur, with huge arms and hands. It was a creature straight out of my worst nightmares. The creature was standing on 2 legs, like a human, but it was clearly not a human. Its face was flat and wide, with a small nose and deep-set eyes that glinted in the sunlight. Its breath was heavy and labored, and I could smell the musky scent of sweat and animal fur. For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other. I could feel the fear coursing through my veins, but I couldn't move. The creature was massive and powerful, and I knew that I was no match for it. Suddenly, the creature let out a deep growl, and I could feel the ground shaking beneath me. It was a warning, a clear message that I was not welcome in this part of the woods. I knew that I had to leave, and I turned and ran as fast as I could back towards my car. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my vehicle. I sat there, shaking and sweating, trying to process what had just happened. I had always been a skeptic when it came to stories of creatures like this, but now I knew that they were real. I had come face to face with something that defied explanation, something that was not of this world.